Friends, thank you very much for joining us once again. James, very nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Ian. Yeah, very good.
We ought to say to see you.
Nice to see you. To see you. Nice. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Those are the days, weren't they? Good old Brucey.
And we're very encouraged, aren't we, James? By last week's video, because lots of people watched it, and we did actually change our suggestion, because now we used to suggest you do three things, which was click the like button, click on the share and pass it on to people, and subscribe. But we also suggested that you might like to make a comment in case you've spotted anything. And we've had some comments, haven't we, James?
And we had lots of comments, and some really interesting and helpful comments as well. Some great reflections. So that was lovely. Thank you very much, and do keep them coming.
Do keep them coming, folks. And we'll also try. One of us will try to respond as well, so get a bit of discussion going on that, which is great. Now, James, where are we in the lectionary?
Right, we have arrived at Luke 21, 5 to 19.
We have, because it's the second Sunday before Advent.
It is the second Sunday before Advent, which is amazing. And
you've done your Christmas shopping yet?
No.
Good. Okay.
I have done absolutely nothing, and I'm going to celebrate Advent first. So
that is the right answer. Now, tell us a bit about Luke 21. So Luke 21 from verse 5. Jesus is where?
So Jesus is in the temple area, and of course he just told this. He just watched this widow give this the widow's mite, as we call it.
We've leapt over because, of course, last time we were looking at
Zacchaeus,
Zacchaeus and Jesus in Jericho.
And
so we've jumped over because, of course, Palm Sunday or non-Palm Sunday is Easter. So we've jumped over. So Jesus has finished his journey to Jerusalem. He's now in Jerusalem.
And then we had, of course, last week we did actually have the interaction with the Sadducees. And
we did.
Just Luke 20.
And they didn't believe the resurrection because they're Sadducees.
They're Sadducee. That's right. And now we just missed out a couple of little narratives, and now we're on to Luke 21. So we've got this. So Jesus in the temple, and the widows put the 2 copper coins in, and he's made this comment. I tell you, this poor widow's put in more than everybody else. Out of her poverty.
Why do you think that is a significant motif as we come into this section, which I mentioned on the blog, this is often called the little apocalypse?
I think there's something going on here, because of course the right at the opening of our narrative is the wow, look at all these wonderful temple buildings. There's actually a contrast between it's highlighting the dysfunctionality of the temple, it seems to me. Right. So what's really important is about what this widow's attitude towards God, and what these folks who speak to Jesus about the temple are on about is something. It's a kind of, as I said to you earlier, it's like a coup-sir moment. It's a sort of, wow, look at that. That's really amazing, isn't it, sir? And they're expecting the response. Yes, isn't it wonderful? But of course, that's not the response that Jesus gives at all. He's right in there, and it's that unexpected response, which, of course, so often with Jesus, that really grabs you, I think, at the beginning of this.
Because you see, it's the widow's mite sets us up to say, look, it's not all the grandiose things, it's not the outward displays, it's not all these fancy buildings that really matter and really demonstrate the health of the people of God and faith, but it's actually the reality of the woman's life and attitude. So that means that, of course, because of this teaching of Jesus, we'd never get wowed by impressive buildings of the church.
No, of course, no. I mean, absolutely not.
Now, we call it the little apocalypse partly because we, as people will well know, some of this material parallels what we find in Mark chapter 13 and in Matthew chapter 24. And on the blog article that I previously published, I put links into my articles on those, which have explored quite a lot. And I've got the Ron Grove book list up here behind me. I realized that I've got my one on spirituality and one on mission. I should have had the one on Kingdom, Hope, and the End of the World, because I should explore that in detail. But there's a couple of bits of complexity here, which I think is worth noting, because quite a bit of the material we find, Mark 13 and Matthew 20, first part of Matthew 24, run very, very closely in parallel, almost word for word, just one or two little subtle changes. But here, some of the wording is very different, and also quite a bit of the material here has been relocated from here, hasn't it, into earlier. We had it in Luke 17.
That's right. Yeah. So Luke actually, absolutely. And so we get this. Well, and of course, it's very interesting when we call it the little apocalypse, because the language is quite apocalyptic, isn't it?
It does seem to be,
you know, it's wars and famines and plagues and pestilence and so that immediately, if you're at all familiar with biblical apocalyptic language, then you kind of you suddenly find yourself in that place where you're thinking apocalyptically. And that can be quite a serious distraction. And I think we're easily distracted with this passage, and we actually really need to sort of engage with it on its own terms, don't we? We have to work harder to do that than we often have to.
I think that's right. I mean, I just looked at, jumping on Luke 21 verse 10. Then he said, "Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Now, I don't know about you, but I'm old enough to remember when I was a teenager that famous songster Larry Norman. He sings this song, "I wish we'd all been ready," because he sings a song, and then in the middle, there's a little bit where he goes, "Nation will rise against nation," and all that. And so it just sort of brings it all back. And I think people might not have that exact thing in mind, but it's an illustration, as we found with other passages, that when there's a tradition of interpretation that we've been sort of nurtured in, it's very hard to put that tradition of reading aside, as you say, and take the text on its own terms.
Yeah, I mean, there's another passage like that. Of course, the one will be taken and another left. That passage is classic in that sense. I mean, you've taught my church on that, Ian, and I remember several people finding it very, very difficult to hear the text as it actually, and what the point it was actually making, even when it's pointed out in black and white, and it's very, very clear.
The ones who are taken at Noah are the ones who are swept away in judgment of the flood. Therefore, the ones who are taken when the parousia of the Son of Man are the ones who are facing judgment. And therefore, I want to be left behind.
Yes, exactly. And of course, so I think it's very similar to that, this passage, and it is hard. But let's see what we can do. Yeah.
Well, just going back to the beginning of the text, one of the things I noticed straight away is that Luke's opening is different, and there's some interesting things to notice there. As you say, there really is a clear sort of connection with the episode of the woman's mite, because there's a couple of things that are different. I mean, in the beginning of Mark 13 and Matthew 24, Jesus is with his disciples, and they are going out of the temple towards the Mount of Olives, because then this conversation, little apocalypse, happens, sometimes called the Olivet Discourse. They're sitting on the Mount of Olives, whereas here we've got a couple of differences here. So actually it says, "And while some were speaking of the temple." Now, I know some English translations sort of sort that out for us, and they coordinate with Matthew and Mark and say some of the disciples are speaking of the temple, but I don't think it is the disciples, is it?
No, it doesn't say that in the text. In fact, what it's a classic Luke. In fact, I think we've noticed this before. Classic Luke phrase: "A certain person" or "some certain people" is what it says here in the actual original, and the disciples are not mentioned at all. No. And I think that's a really important, just to get that context right. That's, and I think the NIV translates that as disciples. The new RSV gets it, much better. It just says when some were talking of the temple. So they're just people who are hanging around, as it were. It almost comes across as though Jesus was overhearing the conversation. Some were speaking about the temple, how it was adorned, and he says this.
And I like this phrase, is really intriguing. I don't know if all the significance is adorned with this translation I'm looking at says noble stones.
Wow. Okay. Beautiful stones.
Beautiful stones. Yeah. It's the word kalos.
Yeah. And with gifts dedicated to God. Yes. Yeah.
There's just on a little bit of a side. This language of kalos, and it's beautiful, is an interesting little a cultural thing there, which is that noble people were often described as kalos kaiagathos. It was a little phrase. And what they meant
beautiful,
was noble and comely, as it were, attractive. So your archetypal military leader or captain or commander or leader would be sort of this person of grace and majesty and power and that sort of thing. So it's got that kind of connotation to it, I think. But noble stones and offerings, isn't that interesting?
Yes, which links to the widow's mite, I think. Yeah,
it does.
Yeah. And I guess it's worth pointing out that, I mean, it's no wonder people were amazed and overwhelmed by this building, because there probably nothing else in their entire lives that they've ever seen anything like it. It's not like us in our sort of built environment where there's loads of wonderful buildings. I mean, I live in Cambridge.
And also you can see pictures of buildings all over the world or videos.
I mean, this would have been the one building that many people, and it would have been completely overwhelming.
And it was one of the wonders of the ancient world.
Yeah, exactly. So
extraordinary.
I
think, and also, I mean, friends, if you haven't had a chance to go and visit Jerusalem and now, it is extraordinary because even what is left, there is mind-boggling in terms of its size, the size of the stone.
Yeah, the scale of it is extraordinary.
It is quite extraordinary. So, and remarkable then that Jesus says there's not one stone will be left upon another; they'll all be thrown down.
Yeah.
Now, in verse 7 again, we get into this interesting language of address, isn't it? Which again confirms that this is not the disciples.
Yes, I mean they call him teacher, and in Luke's gospel, none of his disciples ever call him teacher. They always call him Lord or something like that. So this is very clear from Luke, signposting, as it were, for us that these are people who are not followers of Jesus, but who are.
Because if you are a follower of Jesus, you call him Lord. Yeah.
You can call him Lord. So these are people who are maybe thinking about becoming followers of Jesus, or just interested in this itinerant teacher or whatever it is. Yeah. And obviously, once he says something like, "Well, the temple's it's going to be thrown down," everybody's listening, aren't they? Yeah. They want to hear. I mean, that's just too unbelievable. So of course you're going to find out what he's got to say, even if you just want to laugh at him. But you're going to listen. Yeah.
So then we get into this slightly abbreviated account. I've just realised I don't remember where the reading ends. Verse 19.
19, yeah, it is a bit abbreviated.
It is, and so we only get the first half of what he says, but it is still an awful lot shorter, this section, than the teaching in the version in Matthew 24.
Yeah.
And there's quite a few things that are missing, aren't there? I mean, there's quite a few of the. I suppose I'd say it's quite a few of the particularly distinctively Jewish motifs that Luke omits here. So he omits the language, the eschatological language of birth pangs of the new age.
Yes,
which we find quite early on in Matthew 24 and Mark 13.
And I think I particularly noticed the no mention of false prophets, which of course would have been understandable to a Jewish audience, but not so much to a Gentile audience, I suppose.
Yeah.
So you get that, and some of those Old Testament allusions are not there, which once again, Gentiles wouldn't have got.
Yeah.
So although of course there is a lot of allusion in this passage, actually.
And I wonder whether just peeking over the edge to the passage beyond this, the next section, which we don't look at in the lectionary reading, does give us a bit of a clue to help us think, well, what is this about? And it really, I think for me, noticing this really opened up and saying, is Luke is here Jesus, is Luke recording Jesus talking about the end of the world? In other words, is this looking forward? Well, now we know 2,000 years to something's going to happen in the future, which would be a bit odd because, again, notice that in the middle of this, we have the kind of language we also find quite early on in Matthew 10, as well as in Matthew 24. Before all this, they will lay their hands on you, he says, to the disciples, persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues. So, again, if we just read this in its context with Jesus talking to his followers and potential followers, he's saying, look, this is going to happen to you, which does seem to suggest it's something more proximate.
Yes, within their lifetime, obviously. Yeah.
And then I think for me, one of the critical bits here is that whereas Mark 13 and Matthew 24 then use the phrase from Daniel about the abomination of desolation.
Yes.
And it has in brackets, let the reader understand, because even the first copyists are recognizing that we're going to find this difficult to make sense of.
Yeah.
Instead of that, Jesus says quite explicitly, when you see Jerusalem in verse 20 surrounded by armies, know that its desolation has come near. But he uses the word desolation. So that would suggest that what Jesus is talking about is what's going to happen in the next 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and this with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and I think and it's interesting, isn't it? The question that they ask Jesus is, when will this be? And what will be the sign that it's about to take place? So if you think about if you think about people waiting, it's quite a long wait, isn't it? From when Jesus says this to when it happens, it's 40 years. And actually knowing the sign that it's just about to happen is really important. I don't think we would necessarily ask that question in quite the same way now. I think we'd probably just say when. Well, can you just give us a date? But actually, that's not how that they were working. So I think that verse 20 is the answer to that sign thing.
Yeah.
When you're surrounded with armies, get out. And it's fascinating, although we shouldn't really look at that bit, that Jesus there says, flee. Get out of there. Don't seek martyrdom. Because actually that's not God's intention at this time. At this time, no. We need
and it is, I mean, I don't know if you've done this recently, but if you want to know what an appalling time that was, then there's some really gruesome accounts in Josephus in his account.
Yes.
It talks about all sorts of terrible things happening, and they're so short of food that mothers kill their babies and divide them up and eat them and all that sort of stuff. I mean, it really is. It is bad.
It is horrendous. Yeah. So absolutely.
Now, another thing that then helps is to notice all the different things that Jesus talks about. And I'm just going to share a screen here because I pinched a table from Michael Parsons' commentary. I don't know if you've got it to hand. I don't think I have got it to hand, but we've mentioned it quite a lot before.
There we go. That's Michael Parsons.
There we go. Thank you. And I just thought this analysis was really, really quite helpful, just to notice that. So he lists in this reading, the predictions here. So you'll be arrested, you'll be persecuted, there'll be conflict in the synagogues, you'll be imprisoned, you'll be brought before kings and governors, you'll be given the words to speak, no one could withstand or oppose you, but you will suffer death. And look, there it is in Acts.
It's all there, and it's very, very, very clear.
So
this makes absolutely clear the timetable that Luke's got in mind, isn't it? And how he understands. Yeah.
And we have noticed this before, that we've seen features in Jesus's teaching in Luke's gospel, and then you can see that Luke then includes that almost in a kind of structured way in Acts.
Yes. He often does it quite, I mean, in a sense, this has had to be kind of collated by the commentator. It's quite subtle sometimes. You have to be an intelligent reader, and I think Luke expects you to be an intelligent reader. You know, in other words, just to read with your memory and think about things. So but yeah, very, very instructive.
Just one other thing to notice on here. We'll just look the list. Arrested, so that's in chapters 4 and 5. Now that's Peter, James, and John, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just also notice that one of the things that Luke does in Acts is that he has the experience of Peter, particularly in the first half, and then overlapping with Paul in the second half, and often they mirror each other. So Peter is arrested and Paul is arrested. So there's a sense in persecution during Peter's ministry. There's a sense of persecution, you know, in Paul's ministry. Again, the conflict in the synagogue, Peter and Paul again. So you get things early and late all the time. Peter's imprisoned and then miraculously released. Paul's imprisoned and then he's released. Brought before kings and governors. And again, of course, in Acts, worth noting, Luke is quite careful to use all exactly the right titles for the different
he does,
and governors and rulers and so on for the different which again people were skeptical about once upon a time. And then when we did more excavation, archaeological discoveries, we realized that he'd got all the names right.
Classic.
So okay, so there's a strong correlation. So that does really help us with locating this text.
But I think one of the things it's maybe just worth saying this, in just reflecting on the time scale over which those who heard this from Jesus and those who read it, I suppose, in Luke, they're having to hold on to a prophecy essentially that is not immediately fulfilled. I mean, it's not next Tuesday. You know, it's not. Some of the folk who heard this will have held on to this for 30, 40 years. So I think that's quite interesting in respect of the way prophetic language works. That we often hear, we can often hear things. People make predictions and actually think, well, hopefully that'll happen soon. But I was talking to somebody the other day in their ministry who had some prophetic words given to them 30 years ago, and they said they're just coming true now. We can
gracious.
He said his wife and him could actually see that in their ministry now, and he shared those with me, and it was very, very powerful. But of course, now in his ministry, it's immensely reassuring to say, "Oh, right, okay. Well, actually, we know what we're going through. We know what's happening now because the Lord spoke this to us through somebody." And I suspect the early Christians who heard these words were able to say, "Wait a minute, there's armies surrounding Jerusalem. Okay, we know what to do because she's already told us what to do." So this is that thing that goes on with prophecy, isn't it?
It is. And I think there's some very specific, one of the things I comment on the blog is that there's some very specific things by which we can be reassured. We start off at the beginning by saying, look, people will look at this text and say, oh, that's all forecasting the end times, and oh, look, it's all happening now. We're in the end times. And again, I was in conversation with some people last week. I was doing some teaching on the Book of Revelation, and they said, "Well, you know, life's worse now than it's ever been before, and you know, surely this is it." And well, hang on, wait
a minute.
You know, in the 13th to 14th century, 1/3 of Europe was killed in the plague, in the plague.
Yeah.
So you know, and Genghis Khan slaughtered so many people when he came from the east that you could actually measure the change in the oxygen level in Europe through ice cores because of all the arable land that went back to forest. So I mean, those are pretty terrible things.
Yeah.
So I suppose one of the things that's really helpful about this passage is to say, yes, it feels to us in the moment like everything's going cataclysmically, catastrophically wrong.
Yeah.
Well, that is the way the world is.
Yes.
And so Jesus says it was the fact that this passage isn't about now, it was about then, doesn't need to put us off from saying, but it speaks to us today, because it's in these catastrophic moments all the way through history that we need to hear these reassurances from Jesus.
Yeah, and Jesus tells, in a sense, Jesus gives us some indications here about how to live in those spaces, doesn't he? I mean, he's very clear about, you know, that this gives you a chance to testify to your faith. You know, when he talks about he'll give you words and wisdom. Your lives will be preserved eternally through patient endurance, which I think phrase you pick up. You know, there's actually some really helpful things in here, and in the later passage, which you don't read as well, that about how to live when you're, as you say, you're saying, "Gosh, it's really terrible, isn't it? It must be really, it's as bad as it's ever been." Actually, let's just take a step back here. It may be terrible. We may be tearing our hair out, but this is how we should be living, and Jesus has already given us the instructions we need.
And the thing about apocalyptic language, which is, I need to do a bit more work on thinking about this, but one of the things that occurred to me is that we are, as the human race, we are naturally apocalyptic in our thinking.
Yeah,
I think you can actually find people saying, "Oh my goodness, the world's about to come to an end. It's all been terrible, terrible, terrible." You can find that all the way through history, and there's a sense in which it's just a natural thing to do, that we always feel as though we're living on the verge of a crisis. And into that again, one of the things that Jesus says is, don't allow crazy teaching ideas to put you off. You know, this is just keep, as you say, keep faith, keep steady. You know, I know what's going on, and that is very, for me, that's particularly pertinent, because I suppose I've got the commentary on Revelation now. Most days I get an email from somebody saying, "Hey, I've got the answer to the end of the world, and I know what the And for me, it's a daily reminder saying, "Look, don't be swayed." So I mostly go that can go in the spam folder.
Yeah. But patient endurance is such an important.
It is. And
I think you point out,
there is some interesting connections here with the Book of Revelation. Now, you wouldn't think necessarily of Luke as the gospel which connects with Revelation, but it does. And in particular, some of the things that are catalogued, you actually see strong correspondences between this passage, as well as Matthew 24 and Mark 13, with what happens with the 4 horsemen in Revelation chapter 6.
Right.
Again, you see in my commentary, I say, look, the 4 horsemen is not about something happening in the future. I think, you know, John's readers would read that and say, yes, that's the world we live in.
Yeah.
It is a world of earthquakes and pestilence and famine and drought and all those kinds of things.
Yeah.
But the other connection as well, I think you were going to go on to mention this, that the parable of the sower in Luke 8, unlike Matthew and Mark's version, he does include that explicitly, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. Yeah. And so this is something which Luke is concerned about, and I guess, you know, perhaps partly because of his understanding of the early history of the early Christians in Acts. You know, he's actually thought quite deeply about this, hasn't he? And so it's a natural for him to include that.
Luke 8:15, the seed on the good soil stands for those with a noble. What's that word again?
That's interesting.
A noble and a good heart. We've got who hear the word, retain it, and produce a crop in patient endurance. We need to look at the Greek text here, but wouldn't it be fascinating if there's actually a connection between the language here about the temple and the language here he uses about the heart? Again, as with the widow's mite, it's not with the big fancy outward show and the fancy buildings that matters. What matters is those who have a noble and a good heart.
Yeah.
That's not a bad spot to end on, is it?
It's not. No.
James, thank you very much.
Thank you
for a great conversation. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget those 4 things. Do click on like. What else do they have to do?
Subscribe, share, and comment.
And add some comments. So if you've learned anything here, or if you've spotted something else that we haven't seen, then
interesting, isn't it?
And we'll have those passages. Absolutely. Great. Thanks very much, folks. See you again soon.